for, there we go. Thank you everyone for coming to this class on the guide of the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, by Maimonides. So today we're not going to be looking too much in depth into the guide itself. I'm going to be talking more generally about Jewish philosophy. What is Jewish philosophy, to bring some context from where Maimonides was writing from, and talk about his life story, talk about philosophy in general and Greek philosophy and how Jewish philosophy and Greek philosophy intersect, and the world that he came from, because I think it all really informs what he was doing. And it's so interesting that any talk you will ever go on the guide, or mostly any class, will often begin with, well, what is the guide? And there are so many competing ideas of what exactly the guide is, and nobody, that might be one of the most perplexing parts of the guide, which is it doesn't fit neatly into any box, and people tend to see it through whatever lens they are. So people who tend to want to defend religion against philosophy tend to see the guide as a defense of Judaism against the general Greek philosophy. Mystics will see it as a mystical work. There are many different ways of looking at the guide. But let's go back a little bit, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt. First of all, I'd like to ask who here has studied the guide before, or had encountered the guide before in an academic format or in a shul format? Okay.
Yeah, I've spent, I would say, 40 years reading this pretty well every week. Leo Strauss says he spent about 35 years reading it every week. Leo Strauss has a good angle on this. Anyway, I cannot say after reading it all of this time and studying it that I understand it fully. So it's a very, it's a whole process. I think I understand what Maimonides is doing with this. Okay, I think he's trying to create what's called the actual intellect. And the actual intellect is the route to get close to the divine. Mm-hmm. And he's using a certain method for creating the actual intellect. Mm-hmm. 500 years later, Spinoza is doing the same thing, but he's doing it in a much more logical, rational way. So, and we can compare the two, Maimonides and Spinoza, to get a good look at what Maimonides is up to.
Thank you. Well, we really appreciate your participation in the class and your expertise. And if you could pick up some Arabic, you could translate the book too. Your version of it, the class translation.
That's not my thing. Sorry.
But I like the Spinoza angle, and so far I've been really thinking of comparing him to earlier philosophers like Philo and Saadia Gaon. But we can also compare him to later ones, and we can definitely do that. And my take of Maimonides in the guide is fairly similar to yours, because I'm also an experiential kind of guy, and I see what that's how I see what Maimonides is doing too. He's trying to help us have some kind of mystical experience. Hi, Norma, nice to see you. Glad you were able to make it on.
Well, I'm on my phone. It's not very good, but.
Well, good to see you nonetheless. So I wanted to begin with a little bit with Jewish philosophy. What is philosophy in general, right? So I took a class with Rabbi Brad Artson, who I'm a little bit indebted to. He is the dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles, and he teaches Jewish philosophy, and he is a Jewish philosopher. And I had many conversations with him over long periods about what is Jewish philosophy. And part of what I got out of Jewish philosophy is that philosophy in general is trying to look at the world and saying there is an objective reality, and I want to make sense of what this objective reality of the world is and come to understand it through reason. And Jewish philosophy is different from philosophy because it's often a way of integrating religion, and in this case, Judaism, into that coherent view of the world, and showing that Judaism has what to offer to that coherent view of the world. And so the Jews who were philosophers said, I want to integrate science, because philosophy is a science, right? I want to integrate science and Judaism, because there are a lot of Jews who said, I don't need to integrate science and Judaism. I just will take Judaism, right? Judaism teaches me everything I need to know about the world. And the Jewish philosophers were those often who wanted to have an answer to the Richard Dawkins of the world, who said there is no God, God does not exist, religion is taking us backwards instead of forward. So the Jewish philosophers were those who had one foot in the secular society and one foot in Jewish society, and who wanted to prove that Judaism had something to offer to the world. The Judaism wasn't outdated. The Judaism was a powerful philosophy. And so Rambam, Maimonides, who spends a lot of time arguing against Aristotle, the father of philosophy, ends up also agreeing with him a lot of the time. So what Jewish philosophers ended up actually doing is transforming Judaism, because they brought new ideas into Judaism while grappling with the tradition as received, Talmud and Torah and all of our received tradition, but trying to make sense of it through the lens of philosophy. Also brought philosophy into Judaism, which helped our religion grow. And so Jewish philosophy is unique in that it all goes back to the Torah. All Jewish philosophers try to glean what Judaism's philosophy is, or how Jewish philosophy offers a coherent and rational view of the world, by looking back to our foundational text, which is the Torah. So there are 4 periods of Jewish philosophy in general that we talk about: the ancient world, then medieval, which is where Maimonides works through, and then contemporary and modern. Modern and contemporary, sorry. Modern would be Spinoza, contemporary would be in the last 100 years or so. So I'm just going to mute. And so, Norma, can you mute yourself? Sorry, you're
my computer just came back on. I'll try.
Turn it off.
Okay, perfect. And so the very first philosopher, Jewish philosopher, we could say, was Philo, who lived 2,000 years ago in Egypt. And Philo was Jewish, but he was also part of the greater Greek culture and Greek world. And Philo wanted to harmonize Greek philosophy and Judaism. And Philo believed that the whole of the Bible, the whole of the Torah, is an allegory for how to live ethically. And that was how he proved to the Greek philosopher that Judaism was had what to give in the realm of philosophy. But we can ask the question itself: is the Bible itself philosophy or not? Is the Torah philosophy? And most philosophers would say not, because the Bible in its plain reading is not self-critical, is not trying to be rational. I mean, the Torah is trying to teach us about life and God, but it's not self-critical, it's not rational. So that's why Philo says that the whole Bible is therefore an allegory. You can't read the Bible on its face value, but you have to look deeper into what the Bible is teaching between the lines. And so that sets the stage for Jewish philosophy, where Jewish philosophers are those who have one foot in the tradition and one foot in the secular scientific world. Because there have always been the Jews who said, who needs philosophy and who needs to be embedded in theology? Let's just live Judaism. But the philosophers always wanted Judaism to make sense. And as we know, the Torah doesn't always make sense. And the rabbis themselves were not philosophers either. They were very associative. If you read through the Talmud, the logic isn't A, B, C, D, E. The rabbis like to jump around from A to D to Z. They associate, and they're not interested in pure logic. So this and Philo, the first Jewish philosopher, his philosophy is not accepted into the Jewish canon. Jews continued to see the world through the eyes of the Midrash, which is a lot more romantic, which is a lot more mystical and not quite as rational. So Maimonides, he comes in the medieval period. And in the medieval period, we have the characteristics of it as we have the two monotheistic traditions of Islam and Christianity being in conflict with each other. Right? Islam takes over the Middle East and Northern Africa and starts to come into Europe. It takes over Spain. And all those years, there's battles between physical battles, wars between Christians and Muslims, but also in the sphere of ideas, where Muslims and Christians are trying to prove which is the real monotheism, which is the real faith, where is truth. And we live in a very postmodern world where what is truth is up for grabs. Where is truth? Everybody looks within themselves. But in medieval times, what is truth was very external. People live very fixed lives. You were where you were born. People didn't move around very much. And you belonged to one place. And that's how people understood truth. Truth was eternal. Truth was concrete. And truth would be debated. And so Islam and Christianity were trying to prove who was superior. Islamic culture was flourishing, and Islamic poetry and arts and the Arabic poetry and the Islamic rulers were out there trying to prove how much superior they were to Christianity. So Judaism, which was tiny in comparison, but also was playing this game and saying, well, actually, we're superior to both of you, to both the Jews and the Christians. And at that point, probably up to 90% of all Jews lived in the Muslim world. And Judaism became a lot more frum, a lot more religious, because they were in contact with frum Muslims. They said, we're even more religious than the Muslims. And a lot of our laws of, moving, being more patriarchal, moving women out of the sphere of religious life came out of this period because Muslims were very much focused, very patriarchal in their religion. So a lot of synagogues in this period didn't even have a women's section. Wasn't even upstairs, or wasn't behind a curtain. There wasn't even a women's section because we're even frummer than the Muslims. And Islam was so much about not having iconography, about not portraying anything about the deity in their mosques. We went just that same route. We didn't want to portray anything, any semblance of not being pure monotheistic traditions. So maybe just a very quick word about an earlier Jewish philosopher before Maimonides, Saadia Gaon, Saadia Gaon. He was born in Egypt in 882, and he ended up being one of the leaders of a big yeshiva in Babylon. So we think of yeshivas coming out of Eastern Europe, but really yeshivas go all the way back to the time of the Talmud and to Babylon, to present-day Iraq. And he was just like Maimonides. He was not only a philosopher, but he was a halakhic authority. And he was so respected throughout the whole Jewish world. His halakhic decisions were followed by everyone, that when he said something about philosophy, people felt they had to listen to him. And so his broad shoulders allowed him to also say all kinds of things that other people would have been challenged on. And so Saadia Gaon, kind of preempting the world that Maimonides is going to live in, talks about, well, what is Jewish philosophy? Jewish philosophy has to harmonize both reason and logic and also our tradition. So he talks about 4 sources for finding knowledge in the world: reason and logic, experience and miracles, right? Experience and miracles, many philosophers would not bring in as one of the categories where you can trust logic, but he brings in miracles and experiences. He brings in scripture and he brings in tradition. And he says, what does it mean to be a Jew, a modern Jew in his time, who is believing in reason and logic, who accepts some of the tenets of Greek philosophy, is harmonizing all of those. I harmonize the truths that Torah teaches me, but also what my logic or my reason teaches me. And by the way, I think that a lot of where modern Jews, beginning in maybe the early 20th century, saw themselves as also in the same place, trying to harmonize some of what the scientific world was trying to teach them with what the Torah world was trying to teach them, and where our own conservative Judaism comes from. And so then you come to Maimonides, who just like Sadia Gaon was a genius, someone with really broad shoulders, who was able to both be a halakhic authority and a philosopher. Before I go into Maimonides, I want to talk just a little bit, give a little bit of background on different forms of philosophy. I did not have an extensive period of studying general philosophy. So I've encountered philosophy just from my general rabbinic education and my general interest. But generally, the way to understand philosophy is through two great schools of thought that are joined together. One is from Plato, and Plato has been, his way of thought has been described as perhaps the most successful theory of all time. And Plato's theory, which has really become embedded in all of our Western religion and in our Western way of looking at life, basically says you can't trust your senses. And there is always something deeper behind the surface. So our job is to look beyond the surface. And what's beyond the surface? Plato teaches there's a oneness. And there's a oneness, and out of that oneness, you get the many. There's an far away in the most spiritual realm, there's complete and perfect oneness. And out of that oneness emanates more and more densely physical matter. And until you get to a certain point, which is our world, where spirit and physicality are separated. And just like and that's where we have the idea of a soul and a body. But because the ultimate good, which is God, this is more Neo-Platonism, because the ultimate good is God, is spiritual, we have to focus on what is spiritual. And that means that we try and transcend our senses, try and transcend the concrete to get to that which is eternal, which is spiritual, which is the oneness. And so from that emanation that's cascading down into denser and denser physical world, we're trying to take the reverse path, going further, more and more back into the pure spirit, back into the spiritual world, which means that's what it means to be a religious spiritual person. From Plato's point of view, is to always focus on the spirit and not the body. Aristotle is a little bit different. We don't know much about his actual life. I mean, he's the father of pretty much all Western science. And his basic tenet is that what exists is experience. What we know is that we experience the world, and we can try and reflect on that experience and understand it. And so he just asked a lot of questions of the world around him in all spheres, biology, physics, and trying to understand it. And he had his methodologies. And one of his methodologies is, well, how do you know something is truth? It has to be coherent, it has to be predictive, and it has to be explanatory. So something that will keep happening, if you observe something that keeps happening, then you know that that's predictive. It has to be coherent, it has to make sense within the larger sphere. And then you have to be able to explain it, and then you have a truth. And so in the ancient world, they explained the world through different ways. One is through seeing all the world was made out of fire and air and earth and water, or through dry, wet, hot, cold. And that's essential to his philosophy, as we'll see later. But one of his theories, which really we'll see comes into Maimonides' way of thinking, is the basic idea of what he calls the unmoved mover. So sounds very philosophic, but it's actually quite a simple idea, which is he looked around, he saw the whole world is in motion, and he said, well, where does all of this motion come from? So there has to be that something was set in motion by something else, and then you go all the way back. This thing was moved by this thing, and this thing was moved by this thing, and you go all the way back, At a certain point, you've got to reach a wall where there was an unmoved mover, something that moved everything else, but which itself did not move. And that's what he sees as basically God, is the unmoved mover, which causes everything else to move. Now, if that's what you believe, which is basically close to what Maimonides believes, then God has to be completely unmoving, which means God cannot act, God cannot change, God has to be completely eternal, because if not, God is moving. So God has to be complete perfection. God can't move. You know, if you look purely from this point of view, then you have trouble reading the Bible and God coming down and speaking, or God coming down and doing all the things that God does in the Bible, God being angry or God doing. From this point of view, God does nothing at all. God just is. And then that cascades down into God just emanates. So at the time of Rambam, of Maimonides, Maimonides lives at the very end of the golden age for Jewry in Spain. Maimonides is born in 1138 in Cordoba, Spain. And this is the very end of a golden age. You know, from our point of view, it's not quite as a golden age. Jews are still dhimmis, they're still second-class citizens in the Muslim world. But Jews were allowed to thrive in southern Spain, in northern Spain. Maimonides is born into a family of Jewish intellectuals and traditionalists. His father is a Dayan, a judge, and he comes from this long lineage of Jewish leaders and of sages. Of his great grandfather was a famous judge, and so he grew up with a tradition, but he's also growing up in one of the world centers for cosmopolitan culture and for this interchange between this competition between Christian culture and Islamic culture. He's in the Islamic world, but a ferment of thought, of poetry, of sciences, and Maimonides, whose name, why is his name Maimonides? His name is Moshe ben Maimon. Maimon is his father. And Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, is the acronym for Rambam. So he is a child prodigy. He absorbs the tradition as if it's water. He learns all the laws, all the Talmud, all of the traditional tenets. Yeah, he has a photographic memory and he just instantly memorizes it. He's a once in a, so I'm just going to change. Sorry for that sound. He's a once in a generation mind, maybe a once in 1,000 years mind. He just has this incredible mind, but he's also learning, as anybody who came in and who grew up in an open family in those days, he's also learning about secular science. He's learning about astronomy and mathematics and philosophy from a very young age. And so in his life story, in 1148, just when he's 10 years old, his family has to flee Spain because the Almohads take over the Islamic world, or that section of the Islamic world, and they revoke the dhimmi status of Christians and of Jews. So Jews no longer have a dhimmi status, which means they now either have to convert to Islam or flee. So the Jews, Maimonides, as many Jews, flee at that moment. And for the next decades, he's actually traveling through the Islamic world. Now, this is Maimonides' genius. Even as he's traveling is when he's writing these incredible works that are still read to this day. And it's while he's traveling through Morocco that he writes the Mishneh Torah in 1180. Now, the Mishneh Torah is probably the most beautiful guide of Jewish law that's ever been written. Was once compared to me, described to me as the guide comparable to the Apple. It's the Apple computers of guides to Jewish law. Now, I don't have an Apple computer, so I don't love Apple, but I know what he was saying, which was The Mishnah Torah is beautifully written. It's perfectly organized in 14 chapters. Maimonides was such a master of the Jewish tradition that he does it seemingly effortlessly. What he does in the Mishnah Torah is take all of the Talmud and all of the writings of Jewish law before, and he says, most people don't have time to read, this rabbi says this rabbi says that. I'm just going to write for you a guide of how to live Jewishly from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, bring in every sphere of life. I'm going to spare you all the details and arguments. I'm just going to tell you how to live Jewishly. And because Maimonides didn't want, according to this is what the philosophers think, he didn't want people to be studying Jewish law. What he really wanted for people to be studying philosophy. He said, I'm going to make your Jewish life easy. I'm going to tell you how to live according to the commandments. Maimonides didn't even include in the Mishnah Torah any references to where he came to all of his laws. So when Maimonides says, this is how you put on tefillin, he doesn't say, well, because in the Talmud it says this and this rabbi says this. He just tells you. So there's been, since he wrote the Mishnah Torah in 1180, throughout hundreds and thousands of years, you've had sages after him trying to say, well, where did Maimonides get this? Because I can't find where he came to this. Because Maimonides didn't want to give you that, and he was a genius, and he felt you should be spending your time studying philosophy. And he also was trying to teach people how to think theologically and philosophically. So the whole beginning of the Mishnah Torah is a boot camp in what Jews should think. Now, you've studied Judaism before. Judaism is really about acting, but Maimonides is trying to bring into believing and thinking about God into the discussion of Judaism. So for Maimonides, the most important thing was to contemplate philosophy. And what did he mean by that? Even more than think about the unmoved mover, he believed that the goal of all religion of life was to contemplate God. And this is where people like myself and others see that Maimonides was a rational type of mystic. Because again, for Maimonides, the most important thing in life is to contemplate God. And that's what philosophy is for him. So for Maimonides, who believes, like the Greeks, that God is the unmoved mover, he says, well, God is emanating at all time his divine knowledge to us. And it's what David was talking about earlier. It's up to us to develop what he calls an active intellect to receive what God is emanating out to us. And our job is all to become prophets. And what is a prophet? A prophet is someone who's developed his radio receiver to God's emanation so perfectly that he receives God's will perfectly. And that each one of us, the purpose of religious life is to fine-tune our religious receiver until we're able to understand God's will as perfectly as we can. And because he doesn't believe that God is a mover, but the unmoved mover, then he understands, just like Philo, all of the Bible is an allegory. All of the Bible is not telling you specifically really what God is, but God was working in a language for earlier people, more, even from his time, more primal people, less wise people. And so the Torah had to speak in their language, but embedded in the Torah was the true knowledge of understanding what God truly is. And that when you could contemplate God, what God truly is, then you would truly become enlightened and have this contemplation and experience of God. And so from this point of view, for example, we'll see that he doesn't really believe in miracles. For him, miracles are all embedded into creation itself. When the world was created through the cascading down of materiality, then the miracles were embedded into the plan for the world. It was known that at a certain point of time, the sea would part for Moses' miracle. But the miracles don't aren't able to happen randomly, because everything was worked into creation, and the world generally follows the natural way. He's a naturalist and not a supernaturalist in many ways, but he is in his own way a mystic. And one of Rambam's most important theories is that you can't say what God is, because God is beyond everything. God is beyond anything concrete or physical. You can only say that God is not this. That comes in you. So you come up with a lot of troubles when you're looking at the received tradition, which spends all this time saying God is compassionate, God is loving, God is this. Well, Maimonides says, no, you can't say God is compassionate, but you can say God is not compassionate, or you can say God is not this, because you can never really say what God is. And that's almost a spiritual practice in itself. It's almost a practice in itself of saying what God is. Two more general comments about Maimonides before we get a little bit more into his life and how he came to write the guide. So Maimonides has these two models for him from within the tradition. Again, he's looking at the received tradition through these philosophers' eyes, through these eyes of an enlightened worldly man of his medieval times at the center of the Islamic empire. And so he looks and he sees his two models are Abraham, and he loves Abraham because he sees that Abraham came to understand and recognize God through reason and logic. So he sees Abraham as, this is also the Midrash. The Midrash says Abraham looked up at the stars and said, well, who created the stars? But then the stars set. And then he says, well, who created the sun? But the sun sets. So Abraham says, well, there must be something that is beyond the stars and the sun. And then he intuits God. So this works very well for Maimonides. And he also sees in Moses a different model, someone who is a master of social sciences, of natural sciences, a political leader, and someone in Moses who was so focused on the ethical and moral, and obviously on the contemplation of God. So those are Maimonides' two great guides from within the tradition. And so how did Moses Maimonides, how did his life develop? So Moses Maimonides is wandering through northern Africa. He comes to the Holy Land and he prays on the Temple Mount. And he writes that he had one of the most powerful spiritual experiences of his life there, one which is a jewel for him and his descendants. And I kind of mentioned this to show that Maimonides isn't just a cold philosopher, but he is someone also who's really believes in prayer and in spirit. And then he eventually settles in Egypt, and he writes, works not only in Judaism, but in sciences. And his influence really reaches in the whole Islamic world. He is one of the great, not only the great Jewish minds, but one of just the great minds of his time. And one of the great events of his life is when his brother David goes off as a merchant and dies at sea. And a lot of the family money is tied up in this venture. And Maimonides becomes a physician to support his family. And he eventually becomes physician to the Sultan. He rises so quickly, his fame is so great within the Islamic world, he becomes a physician to the Sultan. And what he writes, not only on medicine, but in so many other spheres, is always with his reasoned mind. He never just accepts what comes before, but he's always writing from his own experience. He's a scientist, he's examining, he's observing. And so while he's doing all of this, right, you read the stories of his life, and he spends all day with the Sultan in the court doing his job. And he comes back home, and at home, he's seeing people who've lined up all day long to see him as a doctor from within the Jewish community and beyond. And then when that's all over, at night is when he's writing the guide and other works, and sleeping just a few hours a night. But that's the kind of mind that he has. So now we come to the guide. And I mentioned this before in this class, that people whose sphere of study is Jewish law will say, Maimonides wasn't really a philosopher. He was halachist. He wrote the Mishneh Torah. The philosophy, he was just trying to respond to the philosophers of his time with the guide to provide them with a way of understanding philosophy Jewishly. And there were so many young people in his time, in his circles, who were turning to philosophy. He was trying to show them that Judaism had what to say. But philosophers will look at it the opposite and say, Maimonides wrote the guide because he was also the most important halachic authority of his time, and he wanted to liberate religious Jews from only thinking about religious law so they could contemplate what he felt was the most important endeavor in life. And even though some scholars believe that he was in opposition to some of the proto-Kabbalists, the early Kabbalists of his time, others believe that he was really a mystic who was trying to explain his own experiences through the language that he knew, which was philosophy, and through the sphere which he knew, which is philosophy. And that's what I tend to gravitate towards. And so, what is the guide? The guide is really, he calls it the guide of the perplexed. And we're going to read today the very beginning. The very beginning of the guide is a letter that he writes to a student of his, and it's the reason, it's the motivation, seemingly, for why he wrote the guide. But the guide itself is a very dense and perplexing book. It's trying to help make one less perplexed, but can easily make one more perplexed. Part of it is because he wrote it in code. He realized that what he was doing was very radical. And as has been pointed out by scholars, sometimes he will say one thing in one part of the guide and the complete opposite in the other part of the guide. And so which one does he mean, one or the other? And he says that within the chapter headings, he's trying to reveal to you the real truth. So the guide can be read on many different levels. And much of the guide is written as an exposition of certain biblical terms and certain ideas of the Bible through the lens of philosophy. So again, he's trying to say, well, through his understanding and the philosophic understanding, God cannot get angry. What does it even mean for God to get angry? So Maimonides wants to explain to you what that really means and what the secret meaning of that is. And when it talks about these different features of God, different qualities of God, what is the secret hidden meaning of that? Now, Maimonides, who believes in hard work to get the secrets, not in just revealing secrets on the internet the way we do, does not want to give it to everyone. And he also believes not everyone is ready to receive these secrets. Not everyone is ready to understand these ideas, and it might lead them to lose faith or to become destabilized in their Judaism. So he writes the whole guide where he doesn't quite say everything that he means to say. Sometimes he stops a step short. Sometimes he supposes that you would have other knowledge to get to it. Now that makes it all the more perplexing for us because we're living from a completely different context than what the people who he was trying to help but not help in his world. We're living in a much different society. So we, on the other hand, his guide is still so enduring in what it has to teach us because of the power of his intellect. And it's, in my mind at least, some of the ideas that he comes to are so radical and so novel that they bring something into Judaism which you can't find anywhere else. And for someone like me, that's what I find most enticing about Maimonides is he'll say things, even if a little bit coded, even within the context of looking at biblical verses that are incredibly interesting and wise and present a different understanding of Judaism than one would get just from the Talmud and Midrash and Torah. And again, he's also worried about his own status within the Jewish world, even though his shoulders are as broad as can be. So he's hiding some of what he's doing by not saying it outright. If you say something that's heresy and then later you say the opposite, nobody can call you completely heretical because you said the opposite somewhere else in the book. So they can't quite pin you down that what you said was heresy. But even before I was in rabbinical school, I remember studying Maimonides and Guide. And there's a place in the Guide where he says, the whole purpose of all the halakha is to come to a place of union with God. This is a very radical statement, And he says, after this, you don't really need Jewish law at all. If you've come to that place, you don't need Jewish law. And I remember mentioning this to a rabbi in yeshiva, and the rabbi said, show me in the Guide where he says that, because he would not believe that Maimonides, Rambam, had said that. So I opened up the Guide and I show him, and he says, well, there's another place in the Guide where he says something to the opposite. So, there's, this is the genius of Maimonides. And it makes it that when you learn Maimonides, and I don't think we'll be able to study the whole thing. You do have to go back. You have to go to other places in the Guide to find cross references. And you also have to study it with an open mind. But I think there is a lot that's incredibly interesting. And so what he says, at its very basis, is the purpose of the Guide is to understand the science of the law, which in essence is the science of the Torah or the science of the mitzvot in their truest sense, meaning how we can use the mitzvot and the ideas that are contained in the Torah in their truest sense, in their deepest, most hidden sense. Anybody have any thoughts or questions before we read the opening letter of the Guide?
You said that he left Spain with his family when he was like 9 or 10, and then they traveled to, where did he end up?
So he ended up in Egypt,
In Egypt.
a little town outside of Cairo.
Okay.
I believe his synagogue where he was still exists there, because he was so respected within the Muslim world and in the Christian world, and even some of his philosophy was very respected by Catholic theology greats, and Maimonides is studied often in Christian seminaries because of his work, and his science work was, up until modern times, had a lot of longevity in both the Islamic and Christian worlds. Anybody else? Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I want to say something about your use of the term mystic. I'm not sure that Maimonides was a mystic. I think Maimonides got to the place where he intuitively understood, not even understood, because understanding is not an aspect of intuition, where he intuited the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you intuit the whole thing, he got curious about that act of intuition. How is it possible that I can intuit the whole thing? Then he has another wave. He tries to bring reason to his act of intuition. Now, the interesting thing about this is he does this in more or less a hidden way, whereas Spinoza is right out there with this kind of stuff. I've been reading Spinoza for the last many months, and it's really enlightened me to the degree that I understand what Maimonides was up to, because Spinoza comes 500 years later. Spinoza was also a student of Maimonides, of Aristotle, and Spinoza has Descartes that he's throwing into the mix. So Spinoza is going to write this thing called the Ethics from a Cartesian perspective, which sort of lays out his notion that you start with the images of things. Maimonides, by the way, in the first chapter of the Guide, starts with the word image. Okay, that's the first chapter of the Guide, not the introduction, but the first chapter. And at the last chapter, he starts with wisdom. So he goes from image to wisdom.
Yeah.
Spinoza does the same thing, but he lays it out. He goes from image to reason to what he calls intuition, which is the actual intellect, which is wisdom. Now, somehow when you get to the goal here, when you get to the actual intellect, which Spinoza got to and Maimonides got to, and lots of other people, my Uncle Jimmy was probably there too. But anyway, it's not such a big deal. But anyway, when you get to there, the experience is one of what they call loving kindness. You feel you feel some kind of illumination with this actual intellect stuff. So that's and what Maimonides is doing, everything that he does is to promote the development of this actual intellect. All of the distinctions that he's making, all of the things that he wants you to think about, is to take you on a trip so that you're not going to get content, you're not going to get information from him, you'll get that too, but he's trying to develop your particular actual intellect. He's trying to take you from a potential intellect to having an actual intellect. Once you get to the actual intellect, you get a prize. Okay, so that's what we're looking for, is we're looking for the prize. And the prize is that somehow, for some reason, you get closer to something divine if you get to the actual intellect. So it's sort of laid, but Maimonides does not lay this out as rationally and is stepwise as Spinoza, because Spinoza didn't care what the Jews thought about him. Okay, so Spinoza could do things that Maimonides couldn't do. He could say things that Maimonides couldn't say. So the other interesting thing about the Maimonides says God has no attributes.
Mhm.
You know what Spinoza says about attributes? God has an infinite number of attributes. They're exactly the opposite, okay? And why they're exactly the opposite is Spinoza found a method for getting to the actual intellect, which has God be everything and a substance which includes everything, etc. Maimonides starts with God having no attributes and gets to the same place. But Maimonides' trip is much more complicated than Spinoza's trip.
Yes.
But I think they're both going to exactly the same place.
Well, Spinoza is pantheistic, right? As you were saying, it's
Yeah,
everything or
I don't know,
pantheism,
pantheistic. I mean,
pantheism or naturalism. But
he doesn't believe that. He's using that as a method.
yeah.
He's using that as a method. I don't know if he's really pantheistic or not. It's a method that collapses everything into a unity right in the beginning.
Mhm.
And from that unity, you can do a lot of stuff.
Well, I agree with you, but I think that what you're calling, or what Maimonides is calling, using the active intellect and the contemplation of God, that's the foundation of mysticism. I mean, contemplating God is essentially, so he might not say that, and he's using reason, he's using words like your imagination, and he's coming to it from a much more intellectual and concrete place. But it's a path towards understanding the mystery, and I think that I agree that he's as compared to Spinoza or many other philosophers or thinkers, everything is much more complex and mysterious because of the context of where he's writing it, and maybe because of his place in the community and all wanting to reveal it, and it does make, because we live in a world where all of that information is a lot more accessible, some of what he's hiding is not as exciting to us as it may have been to his contemporaries. But as you were mentioning at the beginning, his chapter headings, for example, that tells us where he's trying to take us from image forward to wisdom, it's fun and gives us something. But I personally find even more meaning in a similar place, which is all the different ways which he's trying to teach us to reach this place. And I loved how you said that he maybe it's an interesting perspective that he might have stumbled on by intuiting this on this greater mystery and on what we refer to as the kind of mystical world, and then he understood it from his place and came to it from his place. But in some ways it makes it so very valid because it's a fresh path. It's one which he came to himself. in a very unique way, and which gives it, in my mind, an enduring power.
Well, but the only problem I have about calling it mystical is it might turn off some people. You know, it might make people think this is very airy, this is very distant from me. I don't want to be a mystic, but what we're talking about is actually taking a path that is directly inside yourself. Okay,
it's very concrete. It's very reasoned. It's very mind.
Absolutely,
but it's
absolutely.
but it's I wouldn't say it's not abstract, because it can be pretty abstract too.
No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's well. Anyway,
intellectually abstract, not, mysticism can be in some ways more real. But yeah, I agree. No, for anybody who finds that mysticism or even philosophy to be a little too airy, you can look at him as a halachist who's just trying to illumine the tradition for you. So I'd like to share screen and to show. We're going to read together the very beginning, where he talks about, let's see, his epistle to his student. This gives us a sense of what he's working towards. Okay. Okay. Would somebody like to read for us? Alan.
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute myself to say sure. Okay. In the name of the Lord, God of the world, my honored pupil, Rabbi Joseph, may the rock guard you. Son of Rabbi Judah, may his repose be in paradise. When you came to me, having conceived the intention of journeying from the country farthest away in order to read texts under my guidance, I had a high opinion of you because of your strong desire for inquiry and because of what I had observed in your poems of your powerful longing for speculative matters. This was the case since your letters and compositions in rhymed prose came to me from Alexandria before your grasp was put to the test. I said, however, perhaps his longing is stronger than his grasp. When thereupon you read under my guidance texts dealing with the science of astronomy, and prior to that, texts dealing with mathematics, which is necessary as an introduction to astronomy, my joy in you increased because of the excellence of your mind and the quickness of your grasp. I saw that your longing for mathematics was great, and hence I let you train yourself in that science, knowing where you would end. When thereupon you read under my guidance texts dealing with the art of logic, my hope fastened upon you, and I saw that you are one worthy to have the secrets of the prophetic books revealed to you, so that you would consider in them that which perfect men ought to consider. Thereupon, I began to let you see certain flashes to give you certain indications. Then I saw that you demanded of me additional knowledge and asked me to make clear to you certain things pertaining to divine matters, to inform you of the intentions of the Mutukalimum in this respect, and to let you know whether their methods were demonstrative, and if not, to what art they belonged. As I also saw, you had already acquired some smattering of this subject from people other than myself. You were perplexed, as stupefaction had come over you. Your noble soul demanded of you to find out acceptable words. Yet I did not cease dissuading you from this, and enjoining upon you to approach matters in an orderly manner. My purpose in this was that the truth should be established in your mind according to the proper methods, and that certainty should not come to you by accident. Whenever during your association with me a biblical verse or some text of the sages was mentioned in which there was a pointer to some strange notion, I did not refrain from explaining it to you. Then, when God decreed our separation and you betook yourself elsewhere, these meetings aroused in me a resolution that had slackened. Your absence moved me to compose this treatise, which I have composed for you and for those like you, however few they are. I have set it down in dispersed chapters. All of them that are written down will reach you where you are, one after the other. Be in good health.
Thank you. So you can see from the very beginning of his letter, he doesn't want to impart this knowledge easily, right? He wants to take him through this whole course of studying the sciences first. And then he sees that he's had contact with the Islamic philosophers. So he with Kalam, and then so he wants to, he feels ready to give him some of the philosophy. Anybody have any thoughts just from reading that initial letter?
Yeah, he wants to build up. Well, the guy comes to him, Joseph comes to him with a huge amount of logic in his mind. Okay, he studied Ptolemaic astronomy, he studied Aristotle, he studied mathematics. He knows all of that stuff. So this interests Maimonides because he has already the tools of a beginning intellect, if he has all of those things under his belt, so that Maimonides is willing to spend time with him. And the thing is that he has studied some of the things that are important for this particular book that Maimonides is writing too. Not that everybody has to read all of these things and understand them in order to know this, but it certainly would help.
In Maimonides' mind, certainly, to prepare one for the philosophy, for the contents of the guide. Thank you. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
I have,
Go ahead.
sorry. Was this typical for? This is like it reads to me almost. Obviously, it's not a layman's guide. This is written to a person who is some philosopher, as noted by David, some philosophical understanding, some scientific training, or at least reading. And obviously we're talking about the 12th century. So you didn't need, 50 additional degrees. You would go to a school or you'd get independently taught by a scholar, in this case, Maimonides himself. Was this typical for an authority or rabbinical authorities of the time, or even people who were identified as part of the schools of thought, of the Jewish schools of thought, to write like treatises like this, to just, put out something that they were like, hey, we think that a Jewish person with some advanced understanding of the sort of elite level of education that you would need at the time, you could benefit from something like this that would kind of give you a sort of, I hesitate to say it, but it seems like a syncretic understanding of, here's a philosophy, here's a school of philosophy, and here's our Jewish halachic traditions. And these are really complicated, and some of you just follow what they are without really having a deeper understanding of what they are. Was this something that had been done by anybody else in that time or movement, or is what is happening here or being written here truly a revolutionary concept?
I don't think it's revolutionary. I mean, not just in the Jewish study world. I mean, it would have taken that format, right? How much Talmud do you know? Are you ready to go on to the next level of study? And are you ready to study with this teacher? But Maimonides is kind of operating also in the world of science and philosophy. And to me, it seems to be like a pretty typical for its time medieval approach to, taking on a student one-on-one, which is the only way which, at least in some Jewish circles, they thought was the only way to really teach someone one-on-one. You take on a student and you teach them slowly, but they have to have a basis and all the foundation. So to me, that the particular way he phrases it here to me seems more reflective maybe of the philosophers of his time, and maybe the technique, the general approach among the Jews. But I don't really have a sense myself, and I'm not a scholar of this period, or of how many Jewish philosophers there were who, like him, had a foot in each world in such a deep way. I mean, Yehuda Halevi, and there were others Jewish philosophers in that general time period who did, but the fact that he was so well versed and completely embedded in the secular science world, or the Greek philosophy, or however you want it wasn't secular because it was coming from the Islamic world, but completely embedded in that world and in the Jewish world equally, so easily a master of both. And to be able to teach that makes him unique. I'm just noticing the time. I just want to thank everybody for coming to the first one. I know we did a lot of talking, a lot of introductions. And so next week, we're going to start to really get into it. And I'm very grateful that David is with us, who spent so much time studying the guide, to also add his thoughts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was late.
David, thank you.